This is Let's Talk About Myths, baby, and I am your host, Liv, here with a very special episode. Today's conversation is with a woman who's written a book that you all have recommended to me so very many times, and I am so grateful for it. It turns out she was a listener of the podcast and has been for a while, which exploded my whole brain with happiness, and we finally connected and had one of the most fascinating conversations that I've had for this podcast. We got along incredibly well, talked about kind of everything, but I think you're all going to really enjoy it and it's going to really resonate. We talked about the goddesses and kind of what they mean to us, how they interact with each other, how to write about them today, and how you can kind of examine that. A lot to do with how to approach the goddesses today. We talked about women in general, women as monsters, Medusa specifically, of course. We talked about feminism in the world that we're in of classical reception and kind of everything that comes along with that, including the misogyny. We talked about our own intersectional feminism and everything that kind of surrounds that and how we both approach our storytelling. We talked about colonialism in Greek mythology and in life and how Medusa is representative of that. Things I've never considered before, had my brain kind of expanding, and oh my gosh, I'm just very excited for you all to hear this conversation. I do want to say that at one point we go into a bit of a rant about men on the internet and men in person rather, and at one point it's a little too late into the conversation that I realize we should clarify that we are referring to cisgendered heterosexual men. I always find my brain automatically assumes that people will know that that's who I'm referring to, because it tends to be that if men are causing me grief on the internet or in life, they are cisgender hetero. And so I tend to take that as an assumption, and I realize I shouldn't. And so to clarify, you can just assume that our complaints are geared towards them. Honestly, I absolutely love this conversation. We talked for a lot longer than I'm giving you now, so there are a couple little transitions in between where I'd cut out chunks that devolved into personal conversations or things like that. But ultimately, we had an absolutely incredible, super fascinating conversation that I know you're all going to just love. So with those little pieces of information and caveats out of the way, I give you this very special episode. This is episode 104, Medusa, Colonialism, Reimagining Goddesses and Monsters with Nikita Gill. Nikita Gill, author of, amongst other things, The Great Goddesses, which is just so exciting. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited. This is one of my favorite podcasts, so I'm so happy.
That still fully blows my mind. Actually, your book was gifted to me by a listener of the podcast, and I read it when I first got it, and then, it's been a couple of years now almost, and I went back to it before we were chatting, and I guess the person had actually gone into the shop to buy it versus doing it online, because she'd handwritten this note on the bookmark in it that I didn't remember. And I know, it was so sweet. I think her name was Chloe. Of course, I left the bookmark across the room, but I'll edit this in case I got it wrong. But it was I couldn't stop thinking of you while I was reading this book, so I had to give you one. It's just so lovely.
Oh, my readers are sweethearts. I'm telling you, I know a lot of authors must say this about their readers, but I swear to God, I have the kindest audience. When I meet them, and pre-COVID, when we used to be able to meet people at your readings and stuff, people would come to me and tell me these beautiful stories about how they found my books and how the books helped them. And I'd just be sitting there like a puddle of tears going, really? It means that much to you?
I equally have just the absolute nicest listeners in the world, and I think we have a lot of crossover because of our content, so it makes sense. We have just equally lovely people.
I love that. I love that, especially because it's funny, like writing this book felt so much like writing a love letter to the gods in so many ways. And then after the book, like I said to you, on DMs. I feel like I learned a lot because a lot of really amazing classicists kind of reached out to me to talk to me about the book and even about the content that they were like, oh, this is slightly problematic because, this, that, and the other. And it was really nice to learn from them as opposed to just learning from books. You know what I mean? Like, especially
Yeah.
because classics, the books that you read are written predominantly by men, and like the translations are also by men, and like so you don't even realize how problematic it is until someone else explains to you that I know you thought what you did in this, and it's one particular myth. It's the Persephone myth, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Where Demeter is like the mother who kind of stifles her, and Persephone chooses her own path. And I went in because my mom is a bit like stifling. I really went down that route so much because I was like, I get that. I get the idea of choosing your own path and like becoming this like queen of hell, and that really appealed to me. But then someone reached out to me who is a classicist and who's amazing, and she was like, I don't know whether you realize how misogynistic that interpretation of is to Demeter. And I didn't think, and it was really humbling to like sit there and listen and go, oh, you're right. You're absolutely right. And the idea of taking away the survival aspect of Persephone, that she was a survivor of a lot of trauma of that kidnapping, and
Mm-hmm.
going, no, she chose that. You're taking away a narrative from survivors. And as a survivor, that really clicked with me. And I think that learning process is so important when you read or do anything with the classics, and being able to go, yeah, I messed up. I was wrong.
Yeah, I mean, you're describing so many experiences I've had doing this podcast.
Mm.
For me, it's always just been a lot of growth in terms of how I tell the stories and what I focus on, and even just, I think for me too, like I did my degree in classics, but I didn't really intend to use it, and so I didn't dive too deeply into things.
Mm.
And then now I'm doing this, and I started out really like base level, just like overview of the stories, and then now of course, like I'm 4 years in, and I'm reading as many books as I can possibly find on a story in order to tell it. And something that would have taken me at one episode at the beginning is taking me 4 or 5 episodes now. And so for me, it's like it's the same kind of level of like constant learning and taking in all this new information, but I just go like, I have to make it the most accurate thing in the world, and all these different sources say all these different things, and all the and it's of course it's almost impossible to do accuracy in Greek myth.
Oh, absolutely. It's a living thing. Can't do it.
Exactly. Yeah, it's just, you can't really. And so it's such a fascinating thing. Even, I wrote my book in June, and since
Mm.
then I've learned so much that I already wish I could go back and change like all these different things, including even something as basic as there's like a further reading section at the back of my book with book
Yeah.
suggestions, and I'm like, "Oh my god, I missed all these incredible books I should have suggested."
Oh, I feel you. Like, I wish there's so much with Great Goddesses that I wish I could go back. Mainly, it is the Persephone and Demeter kind of bit. But I really liked that poem that I wrote where Demeter was like, essentially, F you, Hades, you gave me back my daughter, how
Mhm.
dare you? That was that poem. When I look back at it now, I'm like, well, she was telling me. She was telling me in the poem that came out of me that this is how she feels, and I didn't honor that. That's such a strange way to put it, but like, I think
No.
you know what I mean?
Yeah,
Some
absolutely. That's fascinating. It's not strange at all. I feel like that means so much on my end as well. I think Demeter is such a complex character, and so I mean, that poem clearly you kind of got exactly. I don't want to say right, but it's also the only word I can think of.
yeah, yeah.
But how would you reapproach some of the other Persephone bits, do you think?
I think I would make more space for the fact that she is a survivor. Like, she
Mm,
was kidnapped, and like her father arranged that kidnapping, right?
yes.
And also, there's a version of the myth that talks about how Zeus actually did rape Persephone,
Mm-hmm,
you
mm-hmm.
know? And Zeus is very much the misogynistic, archetypical, like, god who's like, I'm in control of everything, I control all the things. There are nuances to him as well, of course, but like I feel like the way that he has treated women, all it's been very consistent all through myth, right?
Yes. I would say he's overall the most, like, there's nuances, but there's not that much.
Like you can't make excuses for him, kind of thing. Do you know what
Yeah.
I mean? Like there's he is the way that he is, and a lot of what he does is quite unforgivable. And I feel like that arranging or trafficking of Persephone, because that's what it was. That was trafficking.
Oh, that's so true. Yeah.
And like in today's terms, that's what we would call it. And then this poor mother, like what happens to the victim of trafficking's mother, right?
Mhm.
Like if you see Demeter through a lens of that, it's heartbreaking.
It really is, and I one thing I find interesting, and I learned a bit more about it in my recent chat with Ellie Mackin Roberts, Dr. Ellie Mackin Roberts, about Persephone, and I learned so many fascinating things in that talk, but specifically this idea that we see it that way. It was abduction. It was Zeus sanctioned abduction, but because it was Zeus sanctioned from like a almost legal point of view back then, or the way they would have understood all of that, it was
Mhm.
okay.
Yeah.
It was permitted.
Mm.
And there is kind of an interpretation of Demeter that isn't kind to Demeter, but it is also based in the patriarchy and based in the world of ancient Greece, not so much the
Mm.
character of Demeter, that she was a little bit more angry that she hadn't been consulted on this quote unquote arranged marriage
Mm.
versus
Mm.
the actual thoughts for Persephone. And
Yeah.
I don't necessarily I do think Demeter as a character, it's more suggestive that she would have cared, on
Hmm.
a more
Mm.
personal level, but that's fascinating in itself too, right?
Yeah.
Because Zeus was Persephone's father, and therefore it was his right to
Yeah.
give her to Hades, which is
Yeah.
revolting,
Yeah.
but an extra kind of level to it.
Yeah. Almost like you have disrespected my position in the hierarchy, as opposed to you did this to my daughter. That's
Exactly.
so
Yeah.
fascinating. It really is. Greek myth is it constantly surprises me. I think,
Yeah.
and like what's really great about it is that having discussions with other people who love the myths or who are classicists or who have an interest, and you learn new things about it all the time. And I think that's the most important thing about this, isn't it? You keep like this really open mind and go, I have things to learn. I love that. I love that this has taught me how to do that so much more. That's what this book taught me how to do. Is like listen more, if that makes
Mm.
sense. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel so similarly when it comes to the podcast, just because of how much I've grown, but also how much I have taken in, and I'm constantly learning a new thing that I then want to express somehow and change what I've done in the past. Or
Yeah.
yeah, it's fascinating. One thing that really stood out to me in the book is Medusa, because obviously I
I
love
love
Medusa.
her. I
She's just
love
the
her.
best. But the poem specifically about the Gorgons and like the idea of
Mm,
the Gorgons, I
mm,
feel like you basically put into a beautiful poem the way my brain constantly wants to explain Medusa, and essentially like deconstructed all the fights I've gotten into on Twitter with like shitty misogynists who hate Medusa, which I have a habit of doing. But so often if this it comes up on Twitter so much, and I don't know if
mm,
you've heard my conversation about this exact thing
mm,
as
mm.
well, yeah. But men have this really weird desire on Twitter to like not let women like Medusa.
Yeah.
It's creepy and bizarre, and comes up so often. And so my newest thing to goad them, basically, because it's fun, is there really isn't a lot of description of her monstrosity. There is some description of Gorgon monstrosity, but even that is debatable. But in terms of Medusa, until they started actually depicting her in imagery, and even then, it's nothing crazy. She's just described as a woman, essentially. Like,
Mm,
yes, she's
mm.
named a Gorgon, so she's not mortal.
Yeah.
But it's in the same way that like the Fates aren't mortal, or the
Mm,
Muses aren't mortal, and you're like, well, none of them are monstrous. It's just
yeah.
a new word, Gorgon. And And I find that fascinating, the idea that she has become monstrous because of,
Mm,
all the different things about her as a character, and less so
mm.
because she was actually ever meant to be that way in the original, like, archaic forms of the myths.
She's a fascinating. I feel so awful for Medusa. Like the way that she is, well, what I look at her and think of is colonization. I look at her and think that she is colonized and she is abused and she is like things are taken from her and she fights back and then she's killed.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Yeah.
literally what happens to her, and it's heartbreaking. But if that isn't a metaphor for womanhood, then I don't know what is, you know? Like the minute you
Yeah.
start fighting back, you become a monster. That's what you are. You're a monster. You're not defending yourself. You're a monster. You're
You're
going
a
out of your
monster.
box, which
Yeah.
is probably where that misogynistic men come in, because they also see it, but like they see it on a subconscious level whilst we see it on a conscious level. You know what
Mm,
I mean? And their
yeah.
instant thing is like, how dare you like this creature? You must be a man-hating feminist, is what I get when I defend Medusa.
Yes. Yes. It's so crazy because you can have all of your rational arguments based in contextual, like, primary sources,
Yeah,
and the way that they will bend over backwards to say that that's wrong. I had a guy, and I knew I should have stopped responding at some point, but it was
yeah.
so hard to, because it was so
Mm,
absurd, and I always
mm,
feel the need to defend her.
mm, mm,
And I had somebody who went into all these crazy details, and for one kept changing his argument because he clearly didn't have an argument, but at one point
mm,
was like, of course she's a monster, she terrorized the lands for millennia or generations. And I was like, in what story or pottery or anything, give me one primary example where she terrorized anything? She literally lived at the ends of the earth. Perseus had to travel to the ends of the earth to get her.
mm,
Eh, that she was doing nothing. There's no example of her causing any trouble whatsoever. There is literally, Medusa was a gorgon. She either slept with or was assaulted by Poseidon. I always err on the
mm.
side of assaulted
Yeah,
because it's
yeah,
Poseidon, let
yeah.
alone a god in general. But, and she had snakes for hair, and Perseus killed her. And you're like, that's
Mm,
the whole story, basically. Like, there are
mm,
variations, and Ovid obviously gives us this, like, stunning telling that adds a lot of detail that isn't
mm,
necessarily in the original Greek extant sources.
mm.
But that's it. Like, it's literally like she was a gorgon and Perseus killed her. Like,
That's yeah, yeah.
that's it.
There's this section in Natalie Haynes's new book,
Mm,
Pandora's Jar, where she has a whole chapter on Medusa. And there's something, and it really, I can't forget that paragraph basically, where she talks about Perseus and she says, this is after Perseus has killed her and he's got Medusa's head, right? And he basically takes care of the head with far more care than anyone has ever cared for Medusa in her life.
hmm.
That because it's useful to him. That's the only reason he cares, and he like places it carefully and he looks after it and he makes sure it never goes. And I looked at all of that and I was like, oh my god, even in death, the only way that this woman is cared about is through her uses to men.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
it breaks my heart. It breaks my heart because I know she's fictional, but she is such a metaphor for every survivor and what we go through,
Yeah.
right? Like, how do you, like, when you have survived sexual assault, you don't just like heal from it because you are accused again and again of like making it up. You're gaslit. You're told that, where's your evidence? You're told, everyone knows, and I refuse to believe that even the people who ask for this don't know. It is very hard to prove sexual assault. Like,
Yeah.
it really is. It's very hard. Like, women have gone in and had rape kits done, and there have been lawyers who've been able to prove in court, despite the fact that there was an actual rape kit, there was trauma, there were all sorts of terrible things happening to this woman. They've been able to say that no, 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 she wanted it that way, and the guy's got gone free. And I look at Medusa's story and that's what I see, you know.
Yeah. No,
She's
completely. She has surpassed fiction, I
mm,
think. You
mm,
know, like she's fictional, but she is so much now. She is
mm,
everything you just said, that I think she's gone beyond fiction in a way that not a lot of other characters have. And
mm.
I mean, I personally will defend her to the death, even though she was fictional.
Yeah. Yeah, because I think we all see a bit of ourselves in her because we've all experienced that. I find it very hard to argue with men online. I find them far too emotional and you know, they kind of go into these like they go into histrionics about the most ridiculous things. Like, you know, none of it is based in fact. You know, very few of them will bring facts to the table. Most of them is just like, no, how dare this woman like speak over me? That's the
Yeah.
attitude that they have. So I understand, like, because I've had this argument with men online and like this whole Medusa terrorized so many people. I'm like, you mean the people who invaded her cave to come and kill her? Are we like, what?
Yeah, and even that's like a bit of a modern understanding of her too. Like there's no story of anyone beyond Perseus.
No.
That argument is valid too, because you know, you have to kind of argue her in a modern context where you do have this kind of idea that she was surrounded by stone sculptures of
Right.
men who had tried to kill her, and I like
Yeah.
that idea too, frankly.
Yeah.
um but it's like there's absolutely no evidence that she caused anyone harm whatsoever, not a
she,
single lick of it.
like, the evidence in itself is that she never left that temple.
Yeah, she
She
hid
didn't
to the
leave.
no she literally went to the ends of the earth. Like the way it's described is because obviously they understood, or they believed that the earth had an end, and she lived at it. She
Mm.
moved as far away from civilization as humanly possible, and Perseus still went there to kill her, and we are supposed to believe that she was in some way a villain.
Like, how did we turn this woman into a villain? Like that, even when I was a child, I read Medusa's story and I saw all of those interpretations of her on screen, and I just used to be like, why? Like, if
Yeah.
you go looking to, like, it's the equivalent of even the way that is depicted on screen. They always go looking for her. They go looking for a monster to kill, right? And then they act
Yeah.
as if they're heroes by killing this
Yeah.
monster. And I'm just like, you went into something's home and then you tried to kill it, even if it was a monster. Like, so many hero stories are just of these like men who've just like decided, okay, we're just going to go in there into this place. We are not welcome. And we basically, it like there's a big beware sign in front of it and like stay away. But we're going to go in there and we're going to fight that thing and we're going to kill it and everyone's going to think we're heroes. What?
Yeah, like explain what the heroism is in that moment.
I'm telling you, it's one of those things. It's like this very toxic mix of toxic masculinity with colonization. They intersect at so many points, and that's what it is, isn't it? Like
Yeah.
it's because I come from India, colonization is something I think about a lot. You know, because my grandparents were adults at the time when the British left, so they have all these
Mm.
vivid stories. Like my grandfather told me the story about how there was an orchard because he lived in Kashmir, so there was an orchard next door to him, and like how he used to visit that orchard, and like there were white guards. They were like British guards that guarded that orchard because it was an orchard that the British used to take a lot of fruit from and everything.
Mm.
He talked about how they were like a bunch of like 12 to 13-year-old boys, him and his friends. They were beaten to an inch of their lives for daring to go into the white man's orchard and steal a white man's orchard, which was in our country, in our
Yeah.
it's a horrific story and he tells it in such detail and I look at that and I'm like, that's colonization, isn't it? You go to someone else's land, you go to someone else's home, you take it over, you call it your own, and then the people who are off that land, you villainize them. You turn them into the bad guys, and you beat them and you subhumanize them, and it's just, yeah. I think that's why I identify so much with the monsters in this book, in this book and in Greek myth. All of them. I love
Yeah.
all of them.
Yeah. No, I feel the same way. And that's such a, I mean, for one, that's a horrifying story. And I try to think more and more about colonization in general. I am a white person from Canada, so we've got a lot of shit on our end too. Um and it's such a dark thing, all of it, but I had never thought of Medusa in that way, and I think that's so valid, but also just like it's just such a perfect kind of interpretation
Mm.
of her story.
I had started writing a short story for this book about Medusa.
Mm,
And a lot of stuff didn't make it into this book simply because if everything I had written made it into this book, it would have been about 700 pages long, right? Because I just fell in love with all the stories. I was like, these stories, they're so easy to love, these stories, you know?
they
And
really are.
the thing with the great gods and goddesses and all the monsters and everything is that they're not human, absolutely not, but they're messy. They're so messy, man. Like they remind us of ourselves because they're petty. It is one of those things where you're constantly sitting over there and you're constantly thinking about all the stories that you heard as a child. And so much of this book is just when my mom read me these stories from the Encyclopedia Britannica. I remember we have they're really old now. I think they're my grandfather's. And my mom would read me these stories and I'd be like, but why was Zeus so mean to Hera? Why was he so mean to her? What did she ever do to him that he was so mean to her? And my mom would be like, well, she was mean to the people that he was sleeping with. I'm like, but wasn't he married to her? Like, isn't that like wrong? So my mom is like, this is different. It's like in Greece, that was acceptable for a man to do those things, but like it wasn't acceptable. I'm like, Mom, that sounds really wrong. Because I was like, what, 10? I was like, that just, it
Yeah,
sounds a bit messed up.
that's the thing. And it's I mean, you're just describing like why I have this obsession with these myths that I do, because they're not human, but what makes them so fascinating is those human characteristics. The
Right.
fact that Zeus is an absolute piece of human garbage, just like a just a shitty guy in control of everything. I mean, he's a great sort of symbol for everything. Also, sort of, I don't know if I can make the argument it's in the vein of colonialism. I think I could, but like he's like the British Empire.
He is. He really
It's
is.
like,
That's what he is.
yeah.
And what he does to all of those women is no different from colonization. Like, just what he did to Europa, man. Come on.
Oh my god. I mean, perfect example. Literally Europe. But like there's a fascinating, and I forget where it's from. It might be Roman, but there's a fascinating extra detail of that story that I found when I covered her more recently, that there was somebody who wrote this version where she's visited in a dream by two continents,
Oh,
Asia and
wow.
this unnamed one. And
Hmm.
Asia is where she's from and holds on to her and says, like, I am your home, or I'm going to forget all the details. But essentially, this dream foretells that either, she's going to stay in her home in Asia that loves her, or this like mysterious continent is going to overtake her.
Oh my
And
God.
then, yeah. And so I think this is a later story, but I love it.
It's
And
beautiful.
isn't it? I mean, it fits so well. Obviously, Europe is named for her,
Mm,
but just the idea that she was taken from Asia to become Europe is a
mm.
dark and fascinating thing.
It
I do think
really is.
also says a lot about how the ancient Greeks respected Asia Minor as they saw it,
Mm,
like that
mm,
whole region. I mean, not only did they think that Europa basically like founded Europe from Phoenicia, but they also credit her brother Cadmus for giving them their alphabet. So I think it's fascinating the way they definitely had like a huge amount of respect for not only like, Phoenicia and the whole of what is now kind of modern Turkey, Lebanon area,
right. Yeah.
and but also Egypt. I mean, they had
Yeah.
this huge respect for Egypt. Who Cadmus went to Greece
Mm.
and named Thebes for
I
the
was just
glory
gonna
of
say.
Egypt. Yeah, like it's a very fascinating thing. They were definitely colonizers too, but it's such a
Yeah.
different thing than the British Empire, which
Yeah.
was yeah, it's such
Racist.
an it's exactly like
Very
one had
racist.
one had a level of racism that definitely the ancient Greeks were certainly they had their own kind of version of it, but it
Yeah.
wasn't based in color. It wasn't based
Mm,
in skin color. It was based
absolutely.
in like whether you spoke Greek. So it was kind of easy to fix. You know,
Yeah,
it's
it's
just like,
just
well,
like
I'll
you
learn
learn the
Greek.
language, it's fine.
Yeah, exactly. So they were, yeah, they were like able to respect people from other regions as long as they kind of spoke Greek. But yeah, this different level of this British Empire coming in, and it's such a Zeus thing. It's just overtaking and
Yeah,
destroying everything and
yeah.
just fucking shit up
Well,
completely.
absolutely. Sorry, I'm just swearing now. I find it
I mean,
really.
that's not my whole podcast. Don't worry.
I do see like Zeus, like the running joke is like, who's the father of all the fuck boys? And Zeus is like, me, I am the fuck father. But yeah, I find it's really his and Hera's relationship is very fascinating to me because as the goddess of marriage, she cannot physically leave him. I wrote a version of the story where she did,
Yeah.
because and I loved writing that story because so I started when I started researching this book. I had a little bit of empathy towards Hera, but like I always saw her as the anti woman's woman. Like she was very she took out all of her temper on Zeus's mistresses and his children, and that to me, even if you were cheated on, I found it unforgivable until I really started looking into her as like a goddess. And so I wrote this entire play on her because I'm so obsessed with her now. And it
Mm.
basically is called Maidens, Myths, and Monsters. And it's, she tells the story of Olympus from, the minute they are born, like, and they come out of
Huh.
Kronos, and you see her, why she becomes the way she does, because she was one of Zeus's first victims,
Yeah.
right? He turns into, and the thing with that story that always really hurts me, physically hurts me, is the way that he did it. That he turned himself into a cuckoo. He turned himself into one of her favorite, she loved birds. And he used that against her. Oh my God, it breaks my heart. It breaks my heart. And I acting that because it was a one woman show and it's like a long poem done over an hour where she tells the whole story.
That sounds amazing.
Oh, it was so much fun to do, and it was so much fun to
Oh,
like create and to write, and then I did the show, and there were 10 nights that I did it, and people came back to watch it 2 or 3 times, and they were like, "Oh my God, we want to hate her, but you made it so hard. You've made it so
yeah.
hard because you look at her and you realize that she's a victim of trauma herself, and she hasn't been able to process it." And towards the end, she does get her redemption where she goes, "I'm so tired of this. I'm so tired of him and everything. Like, I'm so tired of being devoured constantly by him,
Mm.
by his stories where he gets to be this affable, lovable scamp, essentially, despite all of the bad things that he does. And I have to be the villain every time. And no one understands my story because I never get to tell it. But yeah, her story really, it shook me when I began to really look into her and realize who she was. Oh, yeah, heartbreaking stuff. What was done to the goddesses?
Absolutely. Hera's one that I want to dive back into because of everything I've kind of learned, but also sort of developed in my own understanding. Because the thing about her too, I mean, everything that you've just said, but I always go to the ancient sources of it because of the type of nerd that I am. And so for me, I just always go back to like, well, who wrote these stories, right?
Mm,
It's and so with Hera, she is a product of the men who wrote down these stories that survive to us today, not necessarily the original stories or
mm,
how everyone in ancient Greece understood her. She's a product of the versions that we have. And in those versions, like Zeus doesn't, I mean, he's doing things wrong, but it's never presented as if like it's actually really harmful in any kind of
mm,
concrete way.
mm.
And I think that's because for the most part, all the victims are women, except for Ganymede, who like gets his place up on Mount Olympus. Like, so it's Hera also, and I mean, setting aside who wrote these stories down, Hera presumably couldn't punish Zeus. and she was sort of so overtaken by, like what you're saying, her own trauma, everything
Mm.
she's experienced being married to the asshole,
Mm.
that, you know, I think she kind of became that sort of patriarchal idea of a woman who will punish the women, because it's that same idea of like in all, you know, old TV shows and probably still way too recently, where a guy cheats on his girlfriend and the girlfriend punches the girl or something, you know, where you're
Yeah.
like, whose fucking fault is it that your
Yeah.
boyfriend cheated? It's not hers. It's
Mm.
absolutely his. And this
Mm.
idea that women will blame other women for something a man does,
Mm.
you know, she's like the first one who ever, yeah, like blamed a woman for a cheating spouse.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yeah, it's so dark, and you know, and she couldn't, what could she have done to the king of the gods anyway?
She tried once, didn't she? She tried, and look what happened to her.
Yeah, that's a story that I keep meaning to tell, and I actually like meant to jot it down today. I was thinking about it as I was reading, like, rereading some of the poems in Great Goddesses, and I was like, I have never actually told the story of when Hera tried to
She
take
did.
down Zeus.
Because people always say, like, why didn't she ever? Why didn't she ever try? Why didn't she did? She tried, and look what he did to her for trying. Like I and who helped him? It was all it's men. It was men who helped him. Like I it really frustrates me. It frustrates me because what she did was incredibly brave. It was a mutiny. She knew what would happen because she knew his temper. I'm sorry, I talk about them like they're real people, don't I? But like I'm so
So do I.
invested. Yeah,
So do
right?
I.
Like I'm so invested in those stories because I see there is so much of a reflection of what women actually go through today in those stories, because people want to believe things like, oh yeah, those stories are so ancient, they don't reflect our modern day. Of course
Oh,
they bloody do. Of course they bloody do. Like the way Medusa is treated as a victim and like re-victimized and re-victimized and villainized. Same way Hera becomes the evil one, even though her husband is the biggest cheat and like assaulter of women. The same way, like so many of the gods get their nuances the way the goddesses don't. The goddesses are always
absolutely.
petty. The goddesses are
Yep.
always petty. No matter how, even if you're Athena, even if and Athena was not a girl's girl, but even so, her mistakes are not as easy to forgive as say Apollo's mistakes.
I think about Aphrodite a lot in those
Oh,
cases. I've always loved her, and I think she's just kind of
she's
still my,
wonderful.
she is. And I I think it's funny. I'm not a person, like I'm not a romantic person, and still like my favorite thing about Aphrodite is that she just said fuck it, and she was just with Ares whenever she wanted, among other men that
Yeah,
she, you
yeah,
know, felt like it at the time. But
yeah,
I love that she and Ares have a, what I consider to be one of the only like legitimate romances. In like they actually loved each other
yeah.
in a way that there's not a lot of other love stories,
It
real love
truly,
stories in Greek mythology.
truly, yeah,
And yet she couldn't actually be with him, but she was just kind of like, fuck it, I don't like my husband. Everyone can know that I don't like my husband. We're just gonna go with it. And I just, yeah, she's kind of had this level of freedom that
yeah, yeah.
not a lot of goddesses had.
Yeah, and the whole relationship between her and Hephaestus is so interesting to me as well.
Absolutely.
I find Hephaestus. I have a lot of love for Hephaestus. Like one of my friends was like, when I
Mm.
was talking about him, I was writing the poems about him. She was like, "You've got to be careful because you're going to end up manifesting a baby." Like at this rate, you love him a little too much. Like calm down. And I think it's because I think Hephaestus being this man who works in a forge, and that's all he loves. Very few things: working in the forge and making these beautiful, like, weapons. And like, especially like for Hermes, when Hermes is a baby, I love that story where Hermes is a baby and Hephaestus makes him his first little like helmet and everything, like, which is like very cute. It's
Oh.
very, very cute. I love it. Like he's there's a real kind side to Hephaestus that you see
Hmm.
over and over and over again in the myths. And he's the one that's gone through the most, They've like thrown him off like Olympus. Whether it was Zeus or Hera who did it, depending on which version of the myth you hear, he was thrown off Olympus, and he ends up disabled because of it. But what does he do with that? Like, he comes back, and he manages to come back in the most conniving way, which I think is pretty slick. Pretty slick.
I think we're on different sides of the Hephaestus spectrum.
I think I find him easier to relate to, because I can understand being hated from the minute you are born and carrying that hatred with you. I can identify with that, and I find it very interesting the way, because people either love him or hate him, right? Like, he's a very
Yeah.
he's a very interesting god, because people either love him or they absolutely they don't like him at all. So I'm on that. So we may be on other ends, but I can understand, because I've met people who can't stand him. So,
No, and I don't say I
yeah,
hate him, and I do think he's
yeah,
fascinating. Like, I think, and like you said, I mean, I think he's very
mm,
complex. He was hated from the beginning, and that is so
mm,
heartbreaking. And he was thrown off Mount Olympus, and that is so
yeah,
heartbreaking. So I personally, I can see why people
mm,
like him so much, and I can see why they identify with him, and I absolutely find him
mm.
sympathetic. But I also go to him
Kira in
trapping
the
Hera
chair.
in a chair
And I
and
love her, and I
him.
still thought that was quite funny. I'm sorry. I shouldn't, but it was
I mean,
funny.
the problem, I think, because I think, especially if you're considering her as the one who threw him off
Yeah,
Mount
yeah.
Olympus, then I'm kind of like, okay, cool. Like, I think that's a good call on your part. I think the darkness for me is that it results in him, Aphrodite, being
That.
basically tricked and forced into
Mm,
marrying him. So I think my problems with him are based around
yeah,
Aphrodite and not so much based around like his original story.
yeah.
Like,
And I love her as well. I find it pretty hard, because I do love all of them independently, and it's because I see them with
yeah.
their nuances, right? I love Aphrodite, and even in the book, I write her crying and crying on her wedding day. And the way I've written him is that he says that, don't do this, she won't love me. Don't do this, she won't love me.
Oh
But like,
yeah.
there was also the element of Zeus being pressured almost by Hera to marry Aphrodite off, because Aphrodite was really beautiful. And like, all of the gods were like fans, it basically, in a way, it threatened Hera's beauty as well, didn't it? Because she's a very beautiful goddess as well. And she is jealous. That's fine. She's jealous. So I saw it from that's the angle I came at it from. And of course, in a book where you're playing and you're telling it in a fictional way, you can do that.
Mm-hmm.
But I
Oh yeah.
always saw it as that must have been so horrible for everyone involved. For Ares, who was made a god of terrible things. For Hephaestus, who, didn't really, I mean, he didn't deserve a wife who didn't love him. He deserved a wife who would stay
No.
with him, right? And for like Aphrodite, who was being forced to marry a man that not only she didn't love, she wasn't attracted to, like, in any way. And she's this
Yeah.
beautiful goddess. Like, and all of those things come together and they create like the ultimate soap opera, really, don't they?
I mean, there's that like love triangle slash everything that goes on between those three, like, is just the
And
best soap
he can
opera of
be so
Olympus by
spiteful,
far.
right, Hephaestus, with the chair, with the fine.
The
Oh,
bed, the chains.
oh my
I love
goodness.
it, but also it's
It's
so
so
dark and
dark.
weird.
It's so dark. Like, this is where like the story that I found really hard to rationalize the story that I was writing. I was like, yeah, but you want him to be this guy who's quite put upon, but he does go and do that, Nikita. Like, because you have to question your own the way you're writing something, right? And I'm like, what if he just waits in your story instead till she finally sees him? What if he
Mm.
just waits? And I was like, yeah, but you're not being very accurate with the myth, are you? And I was like, yeah, but I was like, if I could do it, I'll do it.
Yeah, why not? I don't think there's anything wrong with playing with the myths when it comes to that type
Yeah,
of thing. It's actually something that I find myself struggling with, and I want to get better at it. Like, I'm trying to write fiction based on the myths, but I
it's hard.
am so deep in the
Yeah, it's
accuracy.
hard.
Yeah, and I think it's just especially hard since I have spent these past 4 years of my life, like every waking moment, trying to tell an accurate story. And that's gotten more and more intense for
Mm,
me, especially in the past year. I've become Twitter friends with a lot of
yeah.
classicists, and that has like influenced me to be like, oh my god, like what if I get this thing wrong?
Mm,
Or it's totally on me, and it's my own anxieties. But I find, because I'm so obsessed with making the podcast like as accurate as humanly possible, it makes it very difficult for me to play with the stories in a completely separate medium. I'm trying to make it
yeah,
something different. I want to write fiction desperately, and I'm struggling with it so
yeah.
hard because it's like, yeah, I have trouble getting beyond the characters that I know so well from the
It's
podcast.
really hard. It's really hard. And it's like when I was writing this book, I went through all of that. But because I haven't, like, I wasn't in it as deep as you are, like, with the accuracy and with I read all the books and everything, but I hadn't gone in and spoken to any classicists, I hadn't had that experience that I did question myself. I did sit over there and I go, there is a version of the story where he tries to rape Athena and he does this and he does that. And I
Mm.
looked at all of that and I'm like, your lovely little Hephaestus isn't as lovely little Hephaestus as you think he is. Because there's that mean little voice that you have to have in your head when you're writing all the time, right? Who's your inner critic and that inner critic's really useful, especially when you're writing about the classics. And it's just like, you've had that argument with yourself where you're like, no, I'm making this decision. I know all of this, but I'm making this decision because I want to tell a certain story and I want a certain narrative. Because with fiction, you have to have a single narrative unless you're writing 3 or 4 different perspectives. And this book was like
Mhm.
so many different perspectives, right? And a lot of the gods, like, I feel like I even gave Zeus an out. I said, like, you get to choose. Who do you want to be? Do you want to
Yep.
be king of the gods, or do you just want a happy life? Who do you want to be? And every scenario in my head, because writers do that, where they sit the character down and they interrogate the character. Every single one of those scenarios, he chose to be the king of the gods in my head. Everyone. There was no out for him.
I mean, yeah, that's Zeus. You tried, right? Like, you gave him the chance. It's just he's still Zeus.
Can't do anything about it. You give him as many shots as you want, but he doesn't change. He doesn't change. There are some parts of his personality that are so set, you know. But even with Aphrodite, like, her core personality is so interesting, you know. She's such a fascinating character.
She really is. Yeah, I've always just been just very obsessed with her as a character and the things she experiences, and she, yeah, I don't know what it is about her too. Like, I mean, she's fascinating, she's super complex, but there's just something there. I just love it.
I think there's an independence to her, isn't it? There's an independence to her.
Yeah.
It's something you described right at the beginning when we started talking about her. She does what she wants anyway. She
Yeah.
flouts what Zeus has put on her, and I think that's what makes her so interesting and such a hero to me. Like a true hero.
Yeah. Yeah, she loves who she wants to love. She does what she wants to do. It's one of those things. It's, she really is like, she's got to be one of the most free and independent of the goddesses. I mean, Athena, I think, wants you to believe that she is, but she's really so obsessed
Rules.
with rules and with being accepted by the
Mm,
gods. And by that I mean the men,
yeah. Oh, she's got daddy issues as well, like major daddy issues.
Huge daddy issues. Yeah, huge issues there. And I think she just wants to be one of the guys. You can like dive into what made her
Yeah.
that way, either in the stories or in the culture or whatever. But yeah, Aphrodite is just kind of like, no, whatever, I'm going to do what I
Mm.
want. I'm going to have a ton of kids with Ares, absolutely none with my husband, and just kind of like be this like icon of sex and beauty. And not, it's not even like she sticks with
Mm.
Ares. Like, I believe she and Ares were actually in love. They're like my couple,
Mm.
if I
Mm.
were to have one. But she's even like, no, but like Adonis is really
Yeah.
hot. Like I also want
Yeah.
him, and there's definitely more I can't think of. But I love that she loves Ares. She doesn't love her
Mm.
husband, but she is also willing. She's like, well, no, I'm not sticking with
Mm.
Ares either. Like, I'm gonna have my
Mm.
way. I'm just gonna do whatever the hell
Yeah.
I want.
Yeah. And Hephaestus is married to his forge, isn't he? He's married to his forge. Let's be honest.
Yeah, I mean, I think he tried for a
Yeah.
while. Trapped them in a net, which is
Innovative.
like, it is one of my favorite stories because it is the most absurd, and like
Comical
it's
as
so
fuck.
funny. And it's also one of the most ancient. It's like
Yeah.
it's like Hermes' birth story, where on like his first 3 days of being alive, he kills a turtle, invents the lyre, and then steals Apollo's cows from like all across Greece. And you're like,
And Apollo shows up really pissed off and can't be angry at the
yeah,
baby because it gives him a lyre. And I'm
like
just like, oh my god.
like he hides in his crib under the covers trying to get away from Apollo. It's crazy. And then to think that that was written down somewhere in like 700 BC, and you're like, what? Like, I just want to go back and talk to these people so bad and be like, this was your culture, this is your ancient, like, everyone wants to talk about that this whole ideal of Greece being like, and for better or worse, there's a lot of darkness involved, but the like quote unquote, founders of Western civilization, which is its
I
own
was
level
just
of
gonna
bullshit.
say.
Yeah, right? Where you're like, they invented democracy, and the classic playwrights and the philosophers, they were so brilliant. And then you're like, okay, but in 700 BC, someone was singing about a kid who stole cows from across Greece. Like, or the guy who tried to catch his wife having sex by trapping her and her lover in an invisible net. Like, sure, they also invented democracy, but this came before that. Like,
I just want them to be like, I always picture them like really seriously telling these stories and like getting really pissed off if anyone laughs. Because in my head, that's how I see it. Like,
especially when you're talking about the Homeric hymns, like which is where
yeah.
both of those stories originally come from, or that we know of. They would have been sung, like people are probably like traveling around the Hellenic world singing songs of Hephaestus trapping Aphrodite in a net.
Hilarious. It's actually
Uh,
hilarious. Like, and I think that's why we love these stories so much, is because there's elements of like fun in them, isn't there? Like
yes.
humor. Like, and you see it a little bit in like Hindu mythology. I think pantheons in general,
Mm.
any religion that has a pantheon of gods. There's Loki in the Norse
Yeah, true.
gods, who I can't even talk about without cracking up because he was up to so much mischief. But any religion with a pantheon, there will be humor involved with that pantheon somewhere or the other. My mum tells the most hilarious version of the Mahabharata ever. And the way that she tells it is so funny because you're just sitting over there going, what do you mean? And like she doesn't ever use the characters' names. She just gives them descriptors. So she's like the evil scented lady. So and then the evil scented lady did this, and then like the poor old man was like this, and I was just like, it's far easier to follow the story, funnily enough, without the names, but
Yeah.
like the descriptors instead. But if you hear like my mother's version of the Mahabharata, it's extremely irreverent, but it's so funny, and you're just like, these are our great epics, really?
The ancient people were amazing. Ancient people
Hmm.
across all of Earth had these incredible stories. I want to learn more about the indigenous stories of Canada. It's
Yeah,
hard to find
yeah.
because we have the British Empire really did kind of drill them all into the earth and hide everything.
Yeah.
But yeah, like all these ancient cultures had all these stories to tell, and it was, I mean, it was their version of TV, right? It was like these,
Basically,
yeah,
yeah.
these like oral stories where you're just kind of like, listen, someone's just going to sit in front of a fire and listen to this bard tell you this absolutely bananas story about the gods. And it's just so, yeah, it's just so magnificent. And it's interesting you're
Mm,
saying the way your mom tells the stories of with the descriptors,
yeah,
because I mean that's basically how those old stories in Greece were told too, right? Where
yeah, yeah,
it was always like Aphrodite is the Cyprian goddess or the Cytherian
yeah,
goddess, right? It's
yeah,
that, or the Thracian god would be Ares, and like all these things where
yeah.
you're not necessarily using the name, but you're using this thing about them that reminds people who you're talking about. And I think that it was a part of the oral tradition of just like learning it that way, because you're not reading it, you're not seeing that name. And so I think it's easier to remember the name once you're seeing it. But when you're just listening, I think that's kind of the best way of telling those stories, is that is you use those descriptors. And so clearly your mom was just, or is just like a, basically a Homeric bard.
Well, the Hindus, like my mom's Hindu, my dad's Sikh, but like the Hindus believed in reincarnation, right? So I bet she must have been like somewhere thousands of years ago. She was a bard telling these stories. So it's
Yeah, she
probably
was a Hindu bard just traveling around and telling these ancient
I
stories.
love that idea as well. Like the idea that we've all been here before. And like when I wrote The Girl and the Goddess, so I did Great Goddesses, and then I've done The Girl and the Goddess, and I did an entire novel in verse with like the 9 versions of Shakti, which are the 9 versions of the goddess, basically visiting this child, and kind of as she's growing up in modern day, and the story of reincarnation appears again and again and again, and the whole story of like the Ramayan shows up in the book, and Draupadi, who's one of the main female characters in the Mahabharata, tells the story of the Mahabharata, but only in 9 pages. So like 9 pages for that,
Mm.
now 9 pages for the Ramayana, and the whole thing is told, and it has to be somewhat magical, right? I find it really interesting because Indian people have loved the book. They have, by and large, loved the book. A few people from the West have loved the book, but a lot of the book also deals with calling out colonization. And one thing this book has really done for me
Mm.
is like I can really see the type of person who reads my work and doesn't really want to see the me talk about my own culture.
Mm. Huh.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's really interesting. Like some of the
Yeah.
reviews I've got on this book, or like I even got like a few DMs and emails where people are like, "Why don't you stick to writing about fairy tales and Greek myths instead of writing about like Indians?" I love it when people say Indians as if like I'm not an Indian myself, and they don't
Yeah.
realize how racist they're being when they say that. It's really funny.
That's so dark. You, an Indian woman, stick to the Greeks, would you? What are you doing diving into your own mythologies and cultures? Like, what?
So my father's family, like, they're actually, so our tribe actually did come from Greece. Like the
Oh,
Jersey
wow.
community in general, we did come from Greece, and we settled in, what's now Punjab and everything. And because there's so much casteism, that the tribe didn't really marry outside of the tribe. They stuck within the community.
Mm.
So it's just really interesting because my father has been able to trace his family line back to Greece and
Wow.
everything, which is very cool. Like it's very interesting
Yeah.
to see that we actually came from there. And which would like explain my like obsession with the Greek myths to a certain extent as well, because
Yeah.
it's all about like your roots, right? Where do you come from? All of us spend our whole lives in a way trying to figure out where we came from and to deal with the trauma of what we're given. The chthonic goddesses as well, there's so much to them, like Styx and Hecate and even Persephone later on. And I love the idea of like Hecate kind of being quite protective of Persephone, or Kore as she's becoming Persephone, right? Like I love the idea of like women giving other women the power to survive in these terrible. I love it. I love it all. And maybe I'm making it all up in my head, but like in my head, I see Styx doing the same for Hecate. You
Mm.
know, like it's like a tradition of women, like giving other women this power to survive anything in a world of patriarchy and men who control everything. But do they? Do they
They do
really?
not.
Or is it
They
the
do
women?
not. Yeah. I've been thinking more and more lately about like what stories that must have been told that we don't have, which I think about all the
Yeah.
time, but lately just in terms of the women's stories and like what they must have told each other or their children or whoever
Oh, yeah.
that we
Yeah.
don't have. Like that I would
Yeah.
kill to know what real myths were told by the matriarchs, were told by
Yeah.
the women who really did control the whole household. They just never wrote them
Right.
down, or if they wrote them down, they didn't survive.
Yeah. I kind of wish there were more stories about Hestia, for instance. I think she's such an interesting
And so
goddess.
important, so important. She
Mm.
was completely vital to the ancient Greek home. She was
Mm.
everything. And yet, yeah, we don't have stories of her, which is fascinating. I kind of just picture her as just being so over it. Like I'm
Yeah.
just way too good for your Olympian drama. I'm leaving the Real Housewives of Olympus and I'm just going to be
Yeah.
where I'm needed. And that's like in every ancient Greek person's home. Like, I like to just imagine her just like over their shit. And that's why we don't have anything about
I
her.
literally picture her. This is so off track and it has nothing to I have no evidence for something like this at all. It's just in my head I see it like, Hestia just getting sick of Zeus's bullshit. And like as she's leaving, hands Prometheus the fire and says, "Go on. Do it.
Oh, I
I dare you."
I like that. I feel like that's canon in my head now. That's great. Yeah.
Yeah, it's because as a fiction writer, you kind of if you can find a way to justify it, especially with a goddess like Hestia, because there's not a lot out there
Yeah,
about
you can
her.
justify anything about her.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah.
Because there isn't so much
No.
out there about her. You can just take it and go, what if I just do this?
I love that. I like it. I mean, it takes power away from Prometheus, gives it to a woman. That's A plus. But also just that she was kind of like, nah, fuck you. Like, here you go.
I feel like she's far more. I wish, like you said, we have the stories,
Yeah.
but we don't have any of the stories of the matriarchs. We just have to excavate what we do have, and what we do have is a lot of patriarchal stories told by men, retold by men, and then translated also majority by men.
Yeah.
It's really nice to have like Emily Wilson's translation because it switched everything around, didn't it?
It absolutely did. I love that translation so much. And I know she's working on the Iliad and I'm excited for it. And
I just think what's really funny is that you've shared a few reviews that you get sometimes of the show, and like there are men in the comments or in the reviews who are just like, she seems to hate men, and I'm like, she's just telling the stories as they're written. Like, I'm sorry, men come off badly. Maybe they should have behaved better.
That's the thing. Every time I get reviews like that, I'm like, so what I say is rape is bad. And what you hear is she hates all men. And I just think, you are telling on yourself. You are really, really telling on yourself.
It makes me laugh so much.
Yeah, it's hilarious and horrifying, but I love sharing those ones, the ones that are just so absurd and so obviously based in misogyny. And
Yeah,
I'm like,
yeah, yeah.
I've literally never once implied that all men are bad or that I hate all men. It's the not all men thing, obviously.
Yeah, yeah.
It's that like men, they can recognize what they have done in the things they hear, and therefore they think you're blaming all men. And I'm like, well, then it's because you've done something shitty.
Yeah, that's a you problem.
Yeah, like you're recognizing something shitty. Like, it's the same thing with like white people who can't handle criticism of white people. Not all white people. Like, no, white people are by and large really awful. Colonialism is on us. Like, it's the same fucking thing. And if you can't recognize that, then it just means you're like identifying in it with it in this way that you can't wrap your
Absolutely.
head around. Yeah.
Absolutely. Oh my God. Thank you for saying this because it does. I did a performance of Great Goddesses a while back, and I specifically chose poems about Zeus. Like the hero poem, "Hero invented the rain" poem. I wrote like there were like a few poems I chose, and I guess both Zeus and Poseidon come off quite
They're
badly in my
bad.
book
They're bad.
because
It's
they
not you.
because they do bad
It's
things.
not just
Exactly.
you.
Like,
Poseidon is the secret worst.
oh, he is. He's worse than Zeus in many ways. Like in many ways, and he gets away with it. I don't understand why, but yeah, there was this man in the audience at the end of my show when I said, any questions and answers. I'm like open to any, which is always a mistake.
Yeah, dangerous.
But this guy is like, I have one. Why do you hate men so much? In a crowd, like usually
Oh
they
my
try to
God.
hide it or
But
something.
he was a white man, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
He just stood up and he was just like, why do you hate men so much? And I was like, I'm literally talking about the Greek gods, and I talked about two very specific Greek gods who are not good in this book. And in the poems which I chose to read. Where did you get
Yeah.
"Oh, I hate all men" when you heard that? Because if you identify that much with Zeus and Poseidon, I hate to
Yeah.
tell you,
Yeah.
but the problem's you.
Yeah.
And later on, he bought two copies of Great Goddesses for his
Mm.
daughters, and he told the lady who was organizing the event, because she wouldn't really let him come to talk to me again because she was like, "Oh God, like what's going to happen?"
Yeah.
Bless her for trying to protect
Yeah.
me, basically. But he basically said he was going through a divorce, and maybe like he just kind of blew up a little bit because he thought he took it very personally. And I
Huh.
looked at that and I was like, these are fictional stories. How did
Yeah.
he like come for a Greek mythology thing and think that Zeus or Poseidon were going to come out well in that? Like, I'm sorry he's
Yeah.
going through a divorce. That must be horribly painful. But attacking a female author for I'm going through a
Yeah.
divorce, so I decided to like attack the first woman who talked badly about.
Yeah. About rapists.
Yeah,
Like, yeah, it's all you and I do is literally tell it like it is,
yeah,
and men get furious.
so
It's
angry.
Yeah, it's baffling. It's really baffling. I mean, and I think that it's so important that we do tell the versions like that because
Mm,
like it is not a feminist interpretation to say that Zeus and Poseidon were rapists. That's not feminism. Certain aspects of what I think both of us do is feminism,
yeah,
but that is not. It's a
no.
simple recitation of the stories
Oh
while
yeah.
using accurate terminology. The key is accurate terminology. We're not saying carried off or wrapped away. It's yeah, it's such a bizarre thing the way people hold on to these ideas.
So bizarre, but it speaks a lot about rape culture today, isn't it?
Oh,
Like,
absolutely.
and how intrinsically tied up with masculinity it is, like the concept of masculinity and the concept of rape culture and how closely they intersect with each other. We're not even going to get into like how homoerotic like straight man culture is because that will really trigger people. But you can go looking into it, and it's like I've been having so many conversations with like my younger friends, who really started getting into like feminist theory and learning about it. And like so many of them ask me this question. They're like, "Do you think straight men like women? Like, do you think they actually like women?" And I'm like, "Why would you say that?" And my friends would say, like the amount of men that we've dated who seem to be dating us, but like they will ditch us for the boys, they will go out with the boys, they will make fun of us in front of the boys, but they will sleep with us. I find that really interesting. Like they start to veer down that road. It's like, do you even like women, or do you just like sleeping with women? That's like,
Well, and it's like predatory nature is so wrapped up in straight man culture. It just
mm.
like that predatory talk and actions and all these different things. It's so yeah, it's such a dark and weird thing.
It's
But
all very dark and weird. You're right.
it is, and I always come back to that whole like existence really like of straight cisgendered straight men.
Yeah, cisgendered straight men. Sorry.
Yeah, but no, I know, and I tried to. I often try to say that earlier, but I think that's obvious when we're talking about these things, especially because what I'm going to say is I always come back to this when I hear these nonsensical ideas of trans people being threatening to anyone, and it's like, do you
What?
know who is the threat? It's cisgendered men,
Oh yeah.
primarily cisgendered white men.
Yeah.
They are the
Absolutely.
threat, and the idea that anyone can convince me that that there's any kind of real threat in trans people living their fucking lives like they need to, it's just beyond me. It's so crazy.
It's so nice to talk about this because transphobia is one of the things that is making me most nervous about this country right now.
Yes, Britain is terrifying right now. Oh my god.
The way they treat trans people in this country is horrifying. It is horrifying. It scares the crap out of me because this is the country of like where they had basically made it like illegal for years and years for any kind of material about being gay or bi or anything could even exist. Like you weren't allowed to teach it in schools. It wasn't allowed to exist basically. So if you were gay in this country, you really struggled. Like they basically punished their war hero, Alan Turing, in this country by chemically
Oh yeah.
castrating him. Like, and that was the man that won them the war, right? He was the guy who broke the code that won them the war. That's how they
Yeah.
treat their war heroes for being gay. Now it's turned onto trans people and the way that they're treating. I'm so worried for my visible trans friends because the amount of transphobia online, like if I ever say anything pro trans online, the amount of shit I get, and like I'm called a misogynist, which is laughable, which is like,
Yeah, I know.
yeah.
Well, it's like you often you have these turfs coming in and saying that you're not a feminist because you're supporting trans people, and it's like, I don't think you fucking know what the word means. Like I
Yeah,
don't
yeah, yeah.
yeah,
It's
it's
such a marginalized community, and it is infinitely hard to be trans in a world that constantly rejects you for being trans and for just living your most honest truth in the body that feels most comfortable to you. It
yeah.
is so
Yeah.
hard. And like nobody wants to put themselves in their shoes and see what's going on. It's so frustrating and it's so annoying. Like, and you can't talk sense to these people. You can't sit and talk sense to
No.
TERFs. It's impossible. They're
Yeah.
just there sitting over there going, no, but trans people are taking women's places. And I'm just like,
Yeah.
what? How do
It's
you even come to that? Like
yeah.
where has that even come from? Like how is your womanhood being threatened by a trans woman? I don't
Yeah.
understand.
And they'll find that single anecdote of one thing happening and
Yeah.
being and it's like, well, this is what's happening. You're like, no, that you can't use that as a all trans people thing. Like you
Yeah.
can't. It's yeah, it's horrifying.
Yeah, these are the same people who'll get very upset if you say all women are like this or all cis
Yeah.
women are like this, and you're like, well, if you have a problem with that, why don't you have a problem with using the all trans people are like that? It's such a weird mentality, and it's like you are on the wrong side of history, is what I keep wanting to say to them.
Oh, absolutely. And it's dangerous. It's dangerous. And I think that's what's so important and often not brought up quite as loudly is like this kind of rhetoric is dangerous. Like it's going to cost people their
It
lives.
it and it has
And it
cost
has. Yeah,
people.
exactly.
It's this, and
Yeah.
it's also like my last straw with these people where I get to the point with turfs where I'm just like, you really don't get it, especially when they're from the queer community. When you see people within the queer
Yes.
community, like the
Yeah.
anti-trans, I literally sit over there and I go, it wasn't so long ago when people, and it's still happening, where people think
Yeah.
that you should not have the same rights as a straight person does, that you shouldn't exist. And now you're doing it to another community. How dare you?
Yeah. That's yeah. It's so beyond.
It really
Yeah.
disturbs me. It really disturbs me because as I grew up in a country where being queer, it was absolutely not only a political thing, it was an illegal thing. It was only in
Mhm.
2018 that we got rid of the article that was used to stigmatize the entire queer community in India. Growing up as a bisexual woman, you didn't have anyone to talk to about it. You couldn't talk to anyone about it
Yeah.
because you would be stigmatized for it, but you could also be arrested for it. Growing up with that and seeing something like that happen to another community, like their rights of being like especially like the medical rights being taken away from trans children,
Yes.
that really, I sat and I cried for hours like after that happened, because it is, how can you do that to trans kids? How can you, like,
Yeah.
why are you terrorizing children? Why
Yeah.
are you terrorizing
Like,
people but children? Why children?
yeah. What kind of benefit does it give to anyone else to take? Like, it's just it you can't explain it. It's all just based in just complete hatred.
It is.
Just pointless hate.
It's fascist. It's fascist. You're
Yeah.
taking away the medical rights of a community based off anything, their sexuality, their religion, their, race. That's fascism. That's literally
Mhm.
the definition of it. Like their orientation, what gender they identify as. You're taking the rights away of an entire community that identifies a certain way. What other descriptor is there for that?
Yeah.
And that's what's really hard to explain, because people are like, no, it's not fascism. Show me how it's not.
Yeah.
And all these ancient stories that we read and ancient cultures that we read about, a lot of them are a lot more sexually liberated than we are today.
Mhm. My favorite stories are all the volume, at least in Greek mythology alone, where they understood trans people and they told stories that basically it was like the gods, fixed them.
Mm.
Like, this person was born a man, but she knew she was really a woman, and so a god made her a woman.
Yeah,
And I think it's so beautiful, and also shows that they fully understood the concept of being transgender, and they
absolutely.
were like, cool, well, we get it, like, clearly you're not in the right body, and so when you're not in the right body, like, the only thing that can solve it is a god.
Yeah,
Perfect, here you
yeah,
go.
yeah, yeah.
And they understood it in a way that no one, or that is so hard to get across to people now, where it's just
Mm,
like, they were born in the wrong body.
mm,
I don't know how else to phrase it.
mm.
Like, the ancient Greeks got it, why can't we?
Well, it's the same with Hinduism. Like all of our
Mm.
main three gods, the Trimurti, all had female forms as well.
Mm.
So they had their masculine forms, and then they also had their feminine forms. And Vishnu's feminine form is one of the most well known, as Mohini. And he actually went and had children in that form with like other male gods. And I
Huh.
find that really interesting. Like there's so many, like sexuality is so fluid in like the ancient Hindu scriptures that you read, and you're looking at that and you're like one of my favorite characters from The Girl and the Goddess was one of the major characters in the Mahabharata, and his name is Shikhandi. And Shikhandi was, born in the wrong body originally. He was
Hmm.
born female, like, but he basically over the story becomes like goes into what his natural body is, which is male. And he's one of the most powerful and most brilliant warriors in the Mahabharata, this trans man.
That's Yeah. That's amazing. That's so cool.
And I looked at that and
Yeah.
I'm like, how do our ancient scriptures get it? Well, we don't.
Yeah.
How have we gone this far backward? I don't understand. Like it because progress, we are supposed to be progressive, right? We're supposed to be living in one of the best times in history or whatever, but we don't seem to understand sexuality or gender or orientation or the difference between sex and gender. We don't understand those basic things as a
Yeah.
whole.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, yeah, the way people can communicate now too, over the internet and everything, just means that all those ideals can become like so much more dangerous and
Mm,
visceral and
mm.
loud. And yeah,
Yeah,
because I
yeah.
mean, certainly in the past like couple of 100 years it's been the same, but you
Mm,
couldn't scream about it to
mm,
everyone so
mm.
easily.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, the last 10 years has been a revelation, hasn't it? In just how bigoted even the people you, I swear it's been like so many heartbreaks. And for me, the anti-trans rhetoric in this country has been so scary, because I know people like, and I've seen people who I used to respect, until they turned around and they said something horribly transphobic. And like, I'm
Yeah.
just like, I can't respect you or know you anymore. Like, I can't.
Yeah, it's because it's dangerous. I'm constantly dealing with the fact that at the beginning of the podcast I praised J.K. Rowling
Oh,
because she
yeah.
didn't say that stuff.
Mm,
It wasn't either she didn't think it or she just didn't say it.
mm.
But when I was recording those episodes, it wasn't a thing.
No, it wasn't.
And the thing about podcasts is that they live on always, and that's fine. But people really don't like look at what they're listening to, so they
Mm,
don't look and see like, hey, maybe this woman recorded this before J.K. Rowling was a
yeah,
horrifying turf.
yeah,
And so every once in a while I always want to like make clear how I feel, but then I still have people who like don't follow me on social, or like I've said it in later episodes but I can't guarantee they're going to hear it. And
mm,
the number of people that I'll post something, they're like, oh my god, thank god I thought you were a turf. Or somebody
yeah,
left me a review recently that actually bothered me because it was like, this podcast is great, she's really awesome, she has really awesome feminism, except for praising the turf. And I'm like, well, you just said all those nice things about me and my
mm,
feminism, and maybe, just
mm,
maybe,
mm.
the turf wasn't a turf when I praised her,
Yeah,
like
yeah,
and maybe take that into consideration before. And granted, it was a 5-star review, like I'm not
yeah,
complaining about that, but it bummed me out because they couldn't they couldn't figure it out on their own, that
yeah.
maybe they were listening to something from an earlier time.
Some of the top selling children's book authors in this country right now are racist, or
Yeah,
transphobic, even,
transphobic, yeah.
transphobic. Yeah. And you're just looking at that and you're going, so 50 years down the line, I'm hoping 50 years down the line, we don't have transphobia. Like, I'm hoping,
Yeah.
or if it exists, people are ashamed of it. You know what I mean? And they know it's wrong and they aren't so loud and proud about it. Like, oh my God.
Hello, I'm just popping in here now from the editing stage of this podcast. In between where this last conversation that I've just cut from and our goodbyes, our conversation continued. It got a little bit more personal and just a bit less relevant to the podcast. So I am not including those sections right now, but what that means is that what you're about to hear are little wrap up of goodbyes and whatnot does not suit how we just ended that conversation, which was obviously very serious. I also debated ending it on that conversation about transphobia today and transgender issues. I know it's a bit of a downer to an otherwise more upbeat episode, but I wanted to make sure it stayed in there because I think it's important to talk about these issues as much as possible. I mean, I know, we're not experts on the subject, but at the same time, I think it's important to voice these feelings and thoughts around it, as well as talking openly about how horrific transphobia is, how dangerous, all of that. So I wanted to make sure that it didn't get cut out. And so, with that explanation, you're going to return to me from a later time in our conversation where I am mid-laugh. This has been so much fun. I'm so thrilled that we got to talk about your book, Great Goddesses, but also your other book, The Girl and the Goddess. And
That's a novel in verse. It's a really interesting format. So yeah.
yes, that's fascinating. I'll have to pick that one up too. But thank you so much. Such a fascinating episode, chat, everything. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for taking the time to do this with me. I'm still so thrilled.
I agree. I'm thrilled that we have met in this way. Ugh, nerds, thank you all so much for listening. I hope you appreciate the kind of little bits of choppiness there, because every time it got a little choppy, it was just because she and I went on to talk about so much. Basically, we're friends now. It was amazing. I'm so incredibly thrilled that I got to talk to Nikita all about these fascinating topics, really go into things that I don't often look at, or I wish I could, but it needs that kind of conversational tone. So I'm just thrilled that we had the opportunity to record this episode, and I absolutely hope to have her on again, because I think that these are conversations that need to be had, and I'm thrilled to be able to share it with you all today. So I really hope you all enjoyed this episode, and thank you all so much for listening. Also, we talked for 2 straight hours and I ended up forgetting to ask her what she might have wanted to plug or where you can follow her. So I just recommend you buy all of her books and you find Nikita Gill on whatever your social media of choice is. She is fancy and verified and easy to find. Highly recommend. She posts her poetry on her Instagram and has an incredible Twitter account. So please follow her in both of those places if you are not already. So I always say thank you to you guys, but today I'm giving kind of an extra big thank you because every once in a while get to kind of look around and see what my life has become from this podcast. And obviously it is all because of you nerds who come here twice a week to listen to me either ramble on by myself about these incredible stories or talk to incredible people like Nikita Gill amongst all of the other incredible authors and classicists and just specialists that I've talked to recently. It's kind of mind-blowing and I'm so incredibly grateful to all of you for it. So thank you all so much. You are all magnificent. I am Liv and I love this shit.